Дорогие коллеги,
Distinguished colleagues, I would like to attract your attention to the fact that it's already 5 p.m. The organizers asked us to wait a little bit because there is still the plenary session going on, but we cannot wait, unfortunately, till the end of the plenary session due to different circumstances. So let's take our seats and get to work, because some of us, especially our foreign guests, will have to leave us a bit earlier because of the Airflot's flights. So now I would like to introduce myself. My name is Igor Jurgens. Here I'm as the chairman of the Management Board Institute of Contemporary Development. I'm from the Moscow think tank, so to speak. Here is Giles Merritt, the Friends of Europe, our colleague from Brussels, who is going to moderate the second part of our session. Once again, I would like to remind you that we are going to discuss the topic: does Europe still stretch from Lisbon to Vladivostok? This is not a new topic to Russia and for Russia, historically, ideologically, or politically. Since the times of Peter I and Rus, we are either Europe or not Europe. And when we pass all these big cycles, we either regret or we are happy that we are not Europe, or we are happy that we are Eurasia, or we are looking for the new ways how to join Europe. I believe that we have here very important players and very important representatives. That's why I'm not going to talk too much. But I would like to remind you that we are living in the cycle which started in 1991, when we said to ourselves that we are the part of Europe, and we did a lot to join Europe. Do you remember 4 spaces? Modernization, for instance, and some ideologists and those who are fond of romanticism used to say that we can even join a NATO political structure. We were even discussing the associated membership in European Union. So we were talking about different romantic topics, but all these topics ceased their existence. Unfortunately, we won't be able to analyze all these topics here, but lots of works, scientific works, were written, but we are going to analyze maybe in the future somehow all these issues. But today we are going to focus on 2 blocks of issues. Together with Giles, we decided that the first part of our session will be dedicated to security issues. Here with us we have very reputable people and knowledgeable people who understand a lot in this topic. It's an honor for me to start discussing this important topic as security. But once again, I would like to apologize for Wolfgang Grishenchen, who is the chairman. Wolfgang Ischinger is the chairman of Munich Security Conference. He would have to leave us quite early because of the flight. This is just the necessity, and Wolfgang will have a few words, and then he will have to leave, unfortunately. All the problems that we are facing and which are separating us are rooted in different causes, and there are different solutions to them. So the main problem is the security that we're going to discuss here, and I hope that we will discuss this topic. And I believe that security issues are quite important because we are at the lowest point of our cooperation on this topic of security when we speak about the security in the continent. After we don't, for instance, after we stopped using our work under some contracts such as missile defense or something else. So, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Wolfgang Ischinger, Chairman of Munich Security Conference. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Igor. And I want to apologize to all of you for having to leave early. It's the flight schedule that forces me to leave in just a few minutes. But let me first thank the organizers for inviting me to this forum. This was a very interesting day for me. Since we are only a few weeks away from the annual Munich Security Conference, let me just say, and I think this is not a state secret, that I used the opportunity of meeting with Prime Minister Medvedev a couple of hours ago to lobby him personally and to encourage him to consider coming to Munich and representing the Russian Federation, hopefully in addition to Foreign Minister Lavrov. We are expecting in Munich a very significant American delegation, Vice President, Secretary of State, a large number of senators. We're expecting a member of the Politburo from China. So I think it's, as far as I'm concerned, extremely important that at this difficult moment in our strategic relationship, Russia is adequately represented, broadly represented, highly represented in Munich in February. So let me make 2 points. Let me share a word or two on the diagnosis, which I would imagine most of you would not disagree with, and then let me try to say a word or two about what I think could be done, should be done, maybe needs to be done by Russia and us in the western part of Europe, hopefully together and not against each other. On the diagnosis, I can be very brief. This is a dangerous moment in our history. I agree with those who refuse to use the word, a new Cold War, because the Cold War was so different in terms of ideological differences. But the risks of maybe unintended escalation, the risks of accidents are enormous. And they are so enormous because we experience a lack of communication and a lack of trust, which is almost unprecedented. Ladies and gentlemen, even at the height of the Cold War, we negotiated with each other, seriously, on CSCE issues, on arms control, both conventional and nuclear, on confidence-building measures, at a huge variety of levels. We were talking to each other all the time. At this moment in time, at the beginning of 2019, it's difficult to define any level where we have serious negotiations about anything. This is untenable and dangerous. There is no start. There is obviously the INF treaty about to be disbanded. There is no confidence-building measures, etc. And the most important thing is, as I just said, there is no trust. I'm not suggesting that we are, risking a major confrontation or great power war, even though great power competition is now the new motto, apparently. But what I do think is that Russia and the European Union, for a number of reasons, should try to remedy the situation. We are not in every respect, but in a number of respects, we are in the same boat. and I'm not now going to speak about, terrorism and other common objectives. We are in the same boat because our roles, both the roles of the European Union and that of the Russian Federation, in global terms, our roles are shrinking. The GDP of Russia in 1990 was twice that of China. It is now 1/10 of the Chinese GDP. And the European Union, in terms of global GDP and population, will have its size and its relevance cut in half over the next couple of decades. So if we believe that in the second half of the 21st century, we Russians, Alexander, please come, that we Russians and Europeans want to play a role and represent and defend our interests, I think it is a no-brainer to suggest that that will be significantly easier if we find as much common ground as possible and don't oppose each other and don't talk each other in the way that is currently the case. So I think there is a very, very strong case for trying to go beyond the current untenable situation. What might be, finally, what might be some steps that could be taken, practical steps, not only visionary steps? Well, I think one practical step, more than just a symbol, more than just a gesture, could be, and I think will be, if Russia agrees with the European Union, the resumption of summits, EU-Russia summits. Of course, prepared and underpinned by thorough preparations at different levels. My impression is that my own government, which will have the presidency in the European Union a year from now, would be prepared to take such an initiative, and I think it would be great if there were unity of purpose between us on the EU side and the Russian side to take that up. Point one. Point two, because there is such an enormous absence of trust, and because we have a huge rock obstacle standing between us, which is called Ukraine or Donbass, if not to mention the Crimean issue, I think it would be worth exploring between Russia and us in the western part of the continent, whether it is not possible, and it should be possible, to tackle one of the many unresolved conflicts. I'm not going to bore you with a long list, but it goes from Georgia, of course, Ukraine, and Nagorno-Karabakh, and Transnistria. Whether we cannot define or identify one of these unresolved conflicts and try to set a process in motion that would demonstrate that diplomacy between Russia and Europe can actually work, and that it is possible not to work on the basis of less for less, but more for more in the Russia-EU relationship. This is not a very original idea, what I'm proposing here. It is something which Prime Minister Medvedev, when he was president a decade ago, discussed with Chancellor Merkel. At the time in Meseberg, the idea was maybe we can make a contribution together to the situation in Transnistria. That was not turned into a success, but that doesn't mean that this is not a good idea even today. So I would encourage people to think about whether we cannot find one situation where we can together demonstrate that it is worthwhile working together. Maybe it's not a good idea to start with the most difficult case, but with a smaller case. And last not least, just to finish my brief comments, what is of course extremely worrisome right now and in coming days and weeks and I'm sure months is the arms control and more specifically the INF situation. This is dreadful for someone of my generation who remembers the end of the 70s and the early 80s and the convulsions we had with the process at the time. I continue to believe that the 1987 INF Treaty was an important milestone in overcoming a military situation that was, of course, a part of the Cold War at the time, and it would be terrible if we fell back behind this situation again. So we, unfortunately, play no role in this, which is regrettable, and we have to. The only thing we can do is hand-wringing and make appeals. But I would. I know that we're making all sorts of appeals to our American partners. I would like to just make a very modest suggestion to my Russian friends. Assuming that the INF Treaty goes down the drain and that Russia would then be free from the limitations of this treaty, maybe Russia could consider to make a gesture of confidence building, a gesture of, the Russian interest in stability and in avoiding a new arms race. What if Russia would be willing to say that even if we are now free, because the Americans are walking away, we shall not exploit this situation. We will not build a new generation of weapons in this category if the other side exercises the same restraint. Obviously, that would have to be a condition. I hope that along these lines, we can work together to rebuild over the coming months and years a situation where trust and cooperation will replace mistrust and confrontation. And now, again, Alexander, I said at the beginning, I have to catch my plane, so I'm really sorry that I can't listen to you, but I think I know what you have to say. Because we had a meeting earlier today, a bilateral one.
I will provide the information.
Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое, Вольга.
Thank you very much, Volga. And we hope that we'll see each other at the conference in Munich. And my proposal that Anatolich joins us will be accepted by Mr. Medvedev. So then the permanent representative, Markus Hederer. Markus, if I may ask you to comment on 3 proposals of Wolfgang. Is it true? Can we resume the Russian summits? Is that true that we're capable of trying to address one of the regional conflicts? Because I remember the story, so with Transnistria, etc., and so then Nagorno-Karabakh, so was just evolving in front of our eyes. I'm not talking about more challenging issues of Georgia, and moreover, Ukraine is the ultimate difficulty. And so what have you got to say? And certainly INF, INF is a very interesting challenge as well, because you know that not only us, but China, so they are part of this equation as well. They joined. So over to you, what you have to say on that.
Igor, for inviting me here. It's a pleasure and an honor also to sit together with Alexander. We lost Wolfgang, but you don't need 2 Germans, 1 is enough.
We need all German.
Yes, but you have two Germans, one speaking for the security conference and the other one also not for Germany. So I will certainly comment on what Wolfgang had to propose, but let me come back at the outset to something Igor said about Russia being part of Europe, not part of Europe. It's ultimately up to Russia where it wants to position itself, but seen from the European Union, Russia is part of Europe. I mean, this is our perception, this is how we see it. I know that there are some eminent scholars in this country now who believe that several centuries of Golden Horde has changed the Russian DNA to be more Asian. But when I visit Russia between the Urals and Vladivostok, I see Europe everywhere and European culture and how we mutually reinforced our culture, and I see Genghis Khan nowhere. So I think this is an important point I would like to make, which also says something about how to answer the question, does Europe still stretch from Lisbon to Vladivostok? Now, I was asked to comment a little bit on the questions Wolfgang raised, but let me say first that I fully share his analysis, in particular on the loss of trust. I think here we would even converge between Alexander and me, however, coming from different directions in terms of loss of trust. And I will not, for your benefit, if Alexander promises not to tell the whole Russian story, how we came to the loss of trust, I will not bore you with our story, how we came to the loss of trust, because we are an old couple and we know how to do this almost when you wake us up at 2. But let's try to look at the way forward. I was part of almost everything since 1990 when I was posted here, including the discussion on the 4 spaces, the modernization partnership. I was present at the downfall of the relationship in 2014. I was part of the German team in the Minsk negotiations. I really think from a diplomatic point of view, it is very difficult to simply lift this relationship from where it has fallen, and it can even fall further. Not only because of the loss of trust, but also because of certain events and procedures both sides have engaged. I mean, we have sanctions, counter-sanctions. We have had a bad year, I would say, in 2018 with the Skripal affair, with the attack on OPCW at The Hague, with various other cyber attacks against member states' institutions, and we had the Kerch incident. So I think all of these, if you think of increasing the trust, are rather a program for decreasing the trust. And I think one of the first steps both sides have to think about is to stop activities decreasing the trust on the other side. And I'm saying both sides. I mean, I described a few activities on the other side, but I think we are still in a mode where both sides, in the eyes of the other side, are decreasing the trust. And this would be recipe number 1. Now, when we think about increasing the trust, Wolfgang made a couple of proposals, summits. The summits went down with 2014 and the illegal annexation of Crimea, when the European Union decided that it would suspend all political dialogues, including the summits. Russia was the only country which had 2 summits every year with the European Union, and obviously now we have none. I will reserve judgment on, whether it's useful, whether we can swing it, but let me only say, also in the presence of the Portuguese ambassador, that even if the Germans or anybody else wants to put summits on the agenda again, then they will need consensus amongst 28. And realistically speaking, I do not see this at the moment, not least because our policy is very much contingent on the full implementation of the Minsk agreements. I mean, if we have progress on the Minsk agreements, by 2020 or so. I could imagine that such a move would succeed, but as we speak, I would not say that this move could succeed. Settle one of the regional conflicts. I respect Wolfgang very much, but I feel that except for Ukraine, all the conflicts he has mentioned are frozen. And to settle a frozen conflict may be more difficult than to settle a conflict which is still moving and, if not hot, but at least warm. It's like in physics, any matter which is still formable, shapeable, it can be touched easier and put in the right shape than something which is frozen or from stone. So, frankly, I believe that over time we would converge with Russia on Syria and reconstruction. There are certain conditions which need to be in place, a political process of transition, inclusive process which gives all Syrians the chance to decide on the future of their country. For that, a constitutional assembly, but Russia is making great strides to put that together. And I would imagine that at some point we could work together on remedying the damages in the Syrian conflict. Again, because it's not frozen. And in my personal opinion, I don't also think that the Ukrainian conflict, when it comes to Donbas, is entirely frozen. I still believe that, we could make progress even that year. Maybe Alexander can say a few words on the Russian view. I understand that Russia feels that it cannot move on anything before the end of the Ukrainian electoral cycle, certainly the presidential electoral cycle, but then there's another parliamentary election towards October or so. But I still believe that this can be brought to where the Minsk agreements tried to steer it. So in principle, I agree with Wolfgang, but maybe not on the frozen conflicts he mentioned. I mean, on Transnistria, Alexander, you would agree we are making progress in the framework of the OSCE with a capable Italian representative, Franco Frattini, who has been driving this process within the OSCE very successfully. Small steps forward, but it would also be, I think, a basis of confidence and trust building if we succeeded there. Last INF. It's not really an EU thing, but it is very clear that the EU wants to see the INF treaty stay in place. There are negotiations today between Undersecretary Thompson and Sergei Rabkov in Geneva. We'll see where that takes us, because for the EU it is clear that the damage, if we fail, if Russia and the US fail, will come down on the European countries. What strikes me, and I diplomatically grew up in the Cold War. I came here at the time of the Soviet Union, and I agree with Wolfgang. At the time, we built arms control agreements. Today, and that's the difference, we dismantle them. What strikes me is that we have two sides, Russia and the United States, both deeply convinced that they are not violating the treaty, but the other side is definitely violating the treaty. You know, in the old times, at least one side who was very confident that it was not violating the treaty, but the other side was violating the treaty, would have called for mutual inspections. You know, I mean, if you're so sure, tell the other side to prove that they are right or wrong. It's not happening. And maybe Alexander can answer the question why this is not happening, at least on the Russian side. And if the treaty does not stand the test of time, and people have talked about intermediate nuclear missiles in Iran, in Pakistan, and in China, I think in former times, or new weapons like long-distance drones, which have a similar effect, such as intermediate nuclear missiles, I think with a political will to keep a regime in place which prevents from an arms race, both sides would have sat down and thought, how can we adapt the treaty? I personally do not believe if you involve China that you will come to a solution, as some believe. But maybe adapt the treaty by limiting it to Lisbon to the Urals or something. But I do not see on both sides, and I'm speaking from a third-party perspective, that these proposals are being made. So the question is why they are not being made. Personally, I believe that the danger of conventional conflict triggered by an incident, as Wolfgang said, is actually very pressing. And I also do not see a readiness between the necessary partners to engage in codes of conduct on incident prevention or incident management. Because we may be confronted one day over the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea with a military incident, and then how to contain that. I'm not sure whether we have a good recipe. I know that there's some confliction going on between Russia and the United States in Syria, but there's less of that in the theaters I have just discussed between NATO and Russia. And if we are talking about confidence-building measures, I think besides stopping activities which decrease trust, deconfliction and codes of conduct in order to contain incidents would be of primordial importance. For the next year, this is my last sentence, watch three things. And they decide whether at the end of next year we will be better off, at least between Europe and Russia, or worse off. One is whether we find a sustainable solution to INF. This might be the most difficult part. The second one is, do we find a solution to Russia's membership in the Council of Europe? Talking Lisbon to Vladivostok, this is the only legally binding instrument between Russia, the European Union member states, the Caucasus states, which ties all of us between Lisbon and Vladivostok. It would be a huge mistake if we lost Russia, or if Russia had to walk out from the Council of Europe. And a third one, more specific between the EU and Russia, we will be having another round of trilateral gas talks next Monday in Brussels, where I go, led by Vice President Shevkovich, with Energy Minister Novak in the room, Ukraine in the room. If we find an agreement on gas transit through Ukraine post-2019, I think it would be an important confidence-building measure on which we could build further, more constructive policies in the future. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое, Маркус.
Oh, thank you, Marcos. Thank you, Marcos. Well, it wouldn't be fair because two Germans argue between themselves, and finally it boils down to Alexander, as you know, a person to fix it. So I should give him more time, though we have many good speakers to follow. Alexander Viktorovich, as usual. You are brief and concise and to the point. Shall we be friends with your EU and NATO? Shall we be? Yes, of course. Yeah, I find it very difficult with Germans. Yeah, I could not even open my mouth, and they have been arguing. And into my silence, they have already actually put everything that I would like to hear and to talk. So it's a very philosophic question, where Europe starts and where it ends, you know, making a step behind, you know, step away, and from science. I just go back to the summit of Russia and EU in Khabarovsk. What year was it, Vlad? You don't remember, it doesn't matter. And on the bank of Amur River, Mr. Barroso, at that moment he was chairman of the European Commission, looking at Khabarovsk, which is one of the most European cities in Russia, founded in 1830, and looking like St. Petersburg, he said, now I understand that it's Russia that pulled, you know, stretched the European border to Vladivostok. He was absolutely right, that smart German. And Charles de Gaulle, when he was asked if Russia was part of Europe, he said, Russia is in Europe. I saw it on the map, Charles de Gaulle said. Of course, it's a joke, but it's a serious joke. If we look into the history, not 10 to 20 years ago, which I come back later, but if we just consider the period before the First World War, it would be difficult to imagine Europe, big Europe, somehow separated and there could be borders between the states, though between the musicians of that European concert there were many discrepancies and conflicts. So now when our relations with the European Union grew well in the early 2000s, when we had a joint concept of 4 common spaces, and we had projects with great potential to change the quality of relations of EU and Russia. There was no doubt that in this emerging new world and the conglomerate of EU and Russia will make us both stronger in global competition. In multipolar world, we would be stronger together. And I remember we have done so many studies. We have very deep polls and studies and research about the mutual complementary nature of economics, of our economies, values, common economies, and possibility of common potential in industries like energy and energy union, and our potential merging in the airspace industry, high technologies, transportation, communication, logistics, transit ways, electric grids, green energy, and so many, you name it. And none of the industries, none of the surveys came to the conclusion that it would be impossible. All those surveys and studies turned out positive. And a number of projects which we mentioned today, as I told you, had great potential to change the quality of our relations. Let me mention the visa-free mode, that we were very close, and it's not our fault that the European Union just got too scared and didn't have the guts to continue, and started to walk back, and they told us directly that that it's only the Eastern European countries that will enjoy the visa benefits, but not Russia. And then we had great potential with the initiative to create the Security Council for Russia and European Union, that Chancellor Merkel turned it into a Meserberg initiative, and we suggested concluding an agreement with EU on anti-crisis regulation. We were moving very well in the area of common threats and hazards and the external security space. I'm not mentioning what we did in the scientific exchange, youth exchange, Erasmus Mundus program, and Russia joined the Bologna system. And now it's very clear, is it good or bad for us? Is it boon or bane? But again, I agree. Still, we had, clear-cut philosophy and understanding on both parties that we needed to create objective, unbiased prerequisites for integration. And today, should we look at the situation, but from the point of view of objective situation, I don't think the situation has changed radically. If we start to compare the economic potential and analyze the society and education and the quality of people and other things, I believe that all those elements that were good in creating common space, 1 or 4 or 5, doesn't matter, they all are still there. Nothing has really changed in the practical domain that would actually finally separate and push Russia and the EU in different directions. And we can even see the confirmation of the trade relations. So certainly today it's not 417 billion euros that we used to have in 2013. It's much less. It's less than half. But for the second year, we have been having 21% growth in spite of sanctions. What's the conclusion? That actually life conquers all the political intricacies and prevail over the artificial political difficulties. So what's the conclusion? Is it possible that we could go back to the past? No, we need to be realistic. The window of opportunities that opened at those times and the points of no return that could actually be overcome with the necessary political will, and the European Union finally turned out unfit for equal cooperation. Unfortunately, those windows will be difficult to reopen anew, even if the political will appears again. And secondly, should we speak about the space from Lisbon to Vladivostok, this project will never be so Eurocentric as it was at the turn of the century. All the drivers of economic growth, political and military power moves to Asia, has moved to Asia and keeps moving. And once there is space from Lisbon to Vladivostok, it's going to be Euro-Asian space, which can only come true if the European Union will consider the new realities, including the attempts to find cooperation and all the factors that will keep playing high role in this gigantic Eurasian space. So, on one hand, there are prerequisites and clear things that actually impede such movement. Briefly, very briefly, please. So, those summits will be interesting. Yeah, that's right. Let us first, handle Minsk agreements. Minsk agreements are a way to reintegrate Donetsk and Lugansk back to Ukraine. That's it. They explain how it should be done. It's clear that they need a special status. It's clear national language, linguistic and other protection is needed. It's not a non-innovation. That that derives from the logic of the conflict and experience of the conflict resolution. When our partners in the West start asking questions, probably these Minsk agreements are not good, should we invent something else? What something else? That it's reintegration. I'm saying, well, the reason I'm saying it, Wolfgang said today too, that, well, usually they turn all eyes on Russia. Russia is expected, Russia must, yes, certainly, regarding Minsk agreements, we hoped that it's the EU, it's Europe who, less than others, has vested interest in, shouldn't want a conflict nearby, should be proactive and force the Kiev regime to actually comply to what they signed several times. We keep saying that we are ready to fix the agreements reached at the top level. In the security area, including moving away of armed forces and other measures. Nothing is being done. Marcus says we are skeptical about the future of the Minsk process, as in view of the presidential and of the election campaign. We believe it's wrong, but all our partners says that we should be materialistic and we should not expect any movements from Kiev, because any activity towards Minsk agreement will be considered will mean political suicide of the people who will dare to speak about Minsk agreements in the pre-election time. So European Union says nothing is possible, so nothing will be done. Nothing will develop with Russia until Minsk is achieved. So we are living, in a position that has little link to development. Now, speaking about the INF, Wolfgang is right. It is not just the strategic sustainability issue. As we understand that if INF gets obsolete, if it there will be colossal pressure to strategic offensive balance, especially if there is if American or some other military forces come to Europe. We go back to the
based forces. Then we'll go back to the situation of the 70s and 80s. So when the double decision on NATO was taken. So, but the issue is somewhere else. Stoltenberg said recently that he does not want to speculate concerning the reaction, the response, and the position that NATO would take. That's to think what it might be. But NATO just works both on the military response and on political response. They're working on both about the prospect of launching a new negotiation process. So they're talking about that. And so the military response to what? So the NATO military response, what? No, not to what? So it's only so that the military response of NATO should be the response of NATO leaving INF, and so it's putting the cart before the horse, and it's so what we expect from Europeans. It's a clear-cut. Very well expressed interest related to their own European security. What Europe should say, in my view, so Europe should say, in spite of the decision of NATO leaving INF, we, the Europeans, will never allow, and we're not interested in the prospects of placing of American missiles in Europe. Not waiting from Russia's response, but Europe should identify its own position, should identify its own interest. And if Europe does that, it will certainly change our opinion and our impression on how we can deal with the situation and address the situation if the situation with NATO worsens and it takes the decision because there is not much time left until February the 3rd. Certainly we believe in miracles, but we don't believe much in miracles, and I don't think that anything will change before February the 3rd. So 28 summits have taken place between the EU and Russia. It's a very important viewpoint of consolidation of this gigantic work that was done for many years. And there's huge different sites of cooperation, multifarious sites, multifaceted annual meetings that concerned with every point of commercial, political life. So then the value of these summits was that they were not just the relations between the states, but the depth and the density of these issues, which actually touched upon the lives of every family, households, and people of all walks of life, and created this wonderful atmosphere where we existed. And that's why we vote for it, certainly, but without any prerequisite, without any conditions, without any terms, but on the basis of joint interest. And if we have this joint interest, we'll certainly make progress. And Marcus is right in saying that certainly we need to find simple things to start from, small steps. For example, preventing dangerous military incidents, because we're living in an age of higher military activity. It's very dangerous, and so the military exercises are very close. So then the military fighters are flying in close proximity to borders, but we're so well for it. So definitely, but now the NATO should abandon its position that they took in Welsi and in Warsaw. So they need to abandon, because no military contacts are not possible. As a professional, how can we actually continue to avoid military accidents, safe, unsafe, so keeping certain distance to which the aircraft just can come close together, so without the participation of nonsense of the military. It's impossible to agree on that, and NATO does not want this relationship, and I cannot imagine that. So when we need to think about the de-escalation, about so preventing of erroneous interpretation and preventing incidents. So behind all these slogans, because now they are just slogans, empty words, and but the practical action should follow, actually. And then the resumption of this military relationship is extremely important between us and them, and it's very high in demand right now. So this is the writing is on the wall, it's on the table, and it's there, and we know, but we need certain political steps that need to be taken, so that to depart from the steps that had been taken earlier. And so it's certainly these roundtable discussions, because there will be lots of very smart people discussing things, but there will be no progress made. So we need, so we just go back to what we said earlier. So we look at the objective requirements and opportunities and possibilities. Nothing should stand in the way to move in the right direction. Thank you very much. Thank you. So then I would like just to lengthen, to talk more about the security, but I think that so we're exceeding our time. And so that's why if there are any further questions concerning security, so we'll come back to them, and certainly we'll leave some time, allow some time for the Q&A. Because with that I need just to switch over to jazz, because we have questions concerning to social issues, economics, etc. And because there are more things that unite us together. Because unfortunately, concerning the security issues, we have not yet come to terms. But there are other issues that we need to discuss as well. And so unfortunately, it will take a little bit more time, but I think it was well worth it. Giles, the floor is yours.
Right. We've just heard from 3 top diplomats. Diplomats are there to keep us out of trouble. That's what they do. Nothing much more. I want to focus slightly further ahead. I want to focus mid-century. Before I get on to mid-century, I want to join everybody else in answering the question about Lisbon to Vladivostok. When Alex Grushko was in Brussels, we were very good friends. I'm also very good friends with Vladimir Chisov, Russian ambassador to the European Union. Vladimir loves to tease, and he often turns up at conferences, including those organized by my own think tank. And he stands up and he says, speaking as a representative of the largest European country. Everybody laughs. They're not offended, they laugh. Why do they laugh? Because it's not true. Russia isn't culturally a European country, and that's something we must go back to. Right now, mid-21st century, this has been a terrible century for Russia and for Europe. The European Union has lost its compass, and it's lost its roadmap. It doesn't know where it's going anymore. It's aging very fast. Right now, there are 4 working people per pensioner. In 25 to 30 years' time, there will only be 2 working people per pensioner. So we should be looking very closely at Russia's pension reforms. At the same time, we're getting poorer. 4 EU countries are currently in the global top 10 of rich countries. By 2050, none of them will be there, including Germany. So Europe is in trouble in a world that will grow to 10 billion people, where nuclear proliferation and increased volatility is a real worry that frankly sidelines the old-style Cold War, NATO, Russia tensions. And then let's look at Russia. it's not been a good century for you so far. Your economy is shrinking. Your foreign investors are leaving. You continue to be reliant on energy resources that are getting cheaper. And above all, you don't seem to have learned the lessons of the Cold War. You want to return to being a superpower. How can a country of 143 million that may well be only 111 million by mid-century, how can that become once again a superpower? I don't see it. In size, you're currently right at the end of the 10 largest countries in the world. Give or take 2 or 3 years, the Philippines or Indonesia will have pushed you off that list. So, we've got common problems, Europe and Russia. And when I said that people laughed at Chisov, it's because we know nothing about Russia in Europe. We just don't know enough to do anything but fear you. And I think this is so important. It's not a problem that diplomats can fix. It's a problem that civil societies can fix. I'm a journalist by trade. It's a problem that journalists can fix. It's a problem that think tanks can fix. It's a problem that NGOs can fix. But it needs money. We need some sort of a cultural links program that will start to introduce Russians to Europeans and Europeans to Russians. It's not very difficult, but it's not being done. The other thing is, what governments can do is to start to focus on the things that really matter. And it's not security. Security, I mean, if we don't have security, nothing else matters. But what matters more than the minutiae of the Minsk agreements is global governance. How are we going to fit these new emerging economic superpowers into the way we've been running the global economy? We really have to do something about tax cooperation, about getting trade liberalization back on track. We have to do something about investment rules. We have to do something about development, because all the new population is going to be in very poor countries, mainly Africa, but not entirely. And above all, we have to do something about climate change, of course. And what this requires is for, first of all, Moscow and Brussels to sit down and be much more open-minded, much less 20th century than has been the case so far. And Prime Minister Medvedev was right this morning when or this afternoon at this meeting, he said to us, yeah, well, the EU doesn't have one government. And it's true, having lots of members of the European Union is a very complicating and delaying matter. But that's where we are. So I think what I'm saying is, let's talk about socioeconomic stuff. Let's not talk about it right now. Let's talk about a 30-year perspective up to mid-century. And let's talk about how civil society organizations led by opinion formers can do much more to exchange people, ideas, possible projects, and so on. And that's why I welcome organizations like the Gaidar Forum, which it seems to me is a step in that direction. I founded a think tank 20 years ago called Friends of Europe with no money at all. It's now quite prosperous and healthy. I know a bit about raising money for think tank discussions. I also know that for the last 10 years, I've been trying to raise money for Euro-Russian discussions, and so far, zero. Thanks, Igor.
I thought, Giles, that you will take over even in giving the floors, but if you give it to me for the time being, then think about somebody whom you want to listen to at the moment, just to change the track, с тем, чтобы поменять.
So that we just will change the approach and the subject, and us of the older generation, I'd like to give the floor to Ivan Bektin, who is the director of this NGO, the Center of Information, so that deals with very interesting issues concerning our digitalization. I, as a member of the older generation, so if they just manage to put together this digitalization just before I retire, and so if they manage to do that in time, so just because robots will decide for themselves, but the digitalization of so the robots maybe decide for us, and we won't fight, so they will settle it down. Maybe I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. So then, good afternoon. My specialization is the openness of the state, and then private nature of the existence of human beings, and so it's happening in Russia and Europe, and what's happening. So we need just to stress the fact that one of the key changes that we are observing is the increase of isolationism of the countries and internet. Originally, the net that was designed to be available to everyone, this without borders, without any restrictions and constraints. That was so. Now these restrictions are appearing, and so there are quite a few such restrictions on internet. Specifically, what's happening in Russia, we can say that. So we can observe the separation of Russia from Europe, and so from what we say the Western ecosystem of the internet, and so the researchers identify Chinese, Western, Arabian, and somewhere in the middle. So then it was Cyrillic that united Kazakhstan, Russia, Ukraine, Cyrillic internet. Now this isolationism is growing very rapidly in recent years, and that impacts everything. So then it impacts openness, is disappearing not only from Russia but from other countries around us, for a reason of this people beginning to live with the war that's occurring in their heads.
So people actually forget about the global affairs, and very often they cannot do things or do things that would be used by our economic or political rivals or sides of the conflict. So another problem in the privacy area, so considering that the whole world cooperates more and fighting financial pyramids, online casinos, children pornography, terrorism, so in most countries it would be done through interaction of countries, through cooperation, through eliminating through fighting the areas where perpetrators would feel bad, So the countries interact and they they restrict the opportunity of those perpetrators, from doing so. Unfortunately, Russia, over the last few years, we are following the model of very rigid isolation, excluding any type of cooperation. We need to block an online casino forbidden Russia. It should it doesn't happen as cooperation with the hosting jurisdiction. Just the site would be blocked. And sometimes it happens painfully, but with every day, every month, it it becomes very painful with huge number of errors and with destructing the internet activity, and with the self-isolation of the countries, with the small market volume and the import substitution trends, and then again avoiding payment system, international payment system, we have kind of breakdown of the international cooperation. At a certain moment, we shall not find any Russian participation in some industries of European Union, like providing online contact, and just like other companies who work in the Russian market. So we see more and more restrictions. And speaking about cybersecurity, and it is in modern world is a matter of cooperation. It's impossible to isolate one country or actually copy the products made outside of Russia. You cannot live without cooperation, and we may find ourselves in a less secure situation, just the opposite to what we wish. Thank you for your attention.
To go to Shlomo Weber, can I try and encourage everybody to be short and sharp?
Еще раз, да. Значит, когда я думал об участии...
When I thought about participation in this session, when I read this question about Lisbon to Vladivostok, I actually, well, probably thought that I missed some part of a history. But I never knew that Europe, I never knew that I would be sitting next to the ambassador of Portugal. In fact, answering this question, Alexander may say that one should be realistic, and it's important to create Eurasian economic community, which would be an important element to link Europe to Asia. And that's where I would like to mention two things: cooperation between EU and Russia, where it is possible. We now study carefully the financial integration, and the experience of European Union is very important. We study in the minute detail the mistakes that Brussels has made, and this economic cooperation is very important. And the second, which I would say, second thing that I would say, Alexander mentioned that the trade volume between Russia and the EU has dwindled, but should we consider academic cooperation, a very small element, economic exchange and educational programs? In fact, we keep working together, and we have many European partners and co-authors, and actually it's not very visible, but in fact we are developing our relations, and I think that we do all we can. We work where we can, and we should use those islands of cooperations and just expand them. What I do is I study European Union. I cannot, fail to mention what's happening. I believe that the rules in the European Union, that everything should be unanimously accepted by 28 countries, it's the rule that actually hurts your cooperation, and the sanctions and everything. It was actually decided many years ago for 6 European countries, and when it expanded and the European community grew to 28, those rules cannot apply, cannot support the... I love European Union. I was living in Brussels for many years and in Germany. And in fact, the life is different. And now, what was possible then, it's impossible now. Brexit, somehow we have never mentioned Brexit. Look, in several hours there will be voting in the parliament on the possible Brexit. And in fact, this simple thing, say the UK has left, and the English language should stop being official language, should not be used, but there is no country where English is not the first speaking language. All right, probably we should do without English language, but again, speaking about sanctions and other things are very important, as I mentioned, as an academic person, and I worked in math, and we have the math theory. There is a threshold level of variety or diversity that a group or a union can sustain. What I think happened with the Central and European countries joining the EU, the bloc has expanded so much that the old rules should not apply anymore. Probably you should think about the changes in the rules and structure of the European Union. So I want to be optimistic, and in fact, we need to continue cooperation in many directions. Alexander mentioned it too, and we should work in that in that respect. Thank you.
They're voting right now. Let's go to Ernesto Velengi.
Добрый вечер.
Hello, I don't know. Well, I cannot predict the result in the UK Parliament, but just in case, let me speak in Russian. Within the new import substitution, it would be right to adapt to the local reality, speak in local language. So, in fact, let us look at the last 70 years. 70 years ago, unique people started. There was no European Union, but there was Germany, France, separately, people, nations, politicians. Why don't we be friends? Why can't we be friends with the Soviet Union? Is it good? Is it beneficial? Purely economically, huge unique contracts were signed. Look, energy resources, which Europe needed very much. Well, Europe was hungry for resources, good conditions for prices, for conditions. That's good, we buy. Because we know where the resources are. And thank God, politicians cannot decide where oil is. Nature decides. Oil is in Russia. Good partnership over the last 70 years, it's a fact. Europe is one of the brilliant partners of Russia. $300 billion, the largest turnover between Russia and Europe, the largest we have. But unfortunately, it's going down. But this is new ideology. Unfortunately, very unfortunately, the sanctions, the demand, the ruble exchange rate to dollar, at least it's still there. But what is changing? Over the last 2 years, plus 30% to turnover with China. Now China is $100 billion, growing by 30%, very fast. Over the last 3 years, what happened to direct investment in Europe? Over the last 2 years, $2 billion. China invests $20 billion, 10 times more. Then question, the reserve backup, central bank reserves. In my view, we need to rethink. Let's not invest in dollars, about the process. De-dollarization. We reduce the investment under 46% to 23, and now it's going up to euro from 26 to 33, and 150 times growth into China from 1.5 to 15. That's the new player. China invests cheap money, direct investment, turnover goes up. So that's 1.5 billion people of population, direct competitor to Europe. And unfortunately, we need to mention, even answering the question, I don't know, you say Europe together with the UK or not. But today Parliament will vote and the 13% of the population leaves. And tomorrow we have 63 million of population that it's no more Europe. And then only 500 million population. It's not the Russian market, but we are talking Eurasian market, 200 billion, huge market. And then Europe plus Eurasia is 700 million people, huge potential. But we need the trust. There is no trust, there is no cooperation. Now Europe is, well, after Brexit, it's egoistic or populistic approach. It's just, well, I'm sure that people want to keep the presence in Europe, but it's part of the huge responsibility to the population, to the people. People want to know what is going to happen. If we want to build the relations with Russia, and business wants to build trust, it's not, right in history. Today you have, tomorrow you don't have. We need to set up working groups, so diplomacy should work. But I'm sure that once we have, I'm sure we have more reasons to unite rather than stay separate, Europe and Russia.
Nice.
I think you're right. That is the key question. Are Russia and Europe capable of burying their differences and working together to reverse their decline in the 21st century, their joint decline? Mr. Freeman.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm at a loss because originally I thought that I would talk about security because this is something that I'm dealing with. But now certainly I will just make some recap later on the basis of what I have heard. So this discussion, and I'm from Belarus within the framework of Minsk dialogue, this initiative, and that's why I asked that my position is not properly put down both in Russian and in English, but it's not the reason to be offended. So we actually so the position is not properly written. So there is this layer of problems that can actually be consonant with two different look like that there exist several parallel realities exist because in spite of political differences, so business wants to go forward, it wants more cooperation. And so there are some big brains that understand. So the only way just is to go back to the dialogue, and so some bright minds say that, and this is great, and even from the viewpoint of security, and then some other European states. So they work on this kind of assumption that we need just to go back to this concept of defense. But even they cannot possibly cooperate without a good dialogue, and that is why we need just to fish out the best things that we had before, and so then we spoke about this dynamics between the trade dynamics, which is positive between the EU and Russia. But once we talk about political issues, so we immediately come up against this wall. And in our work, this dialogue site, so that's where I work. And so it looks like, so then some events take place, so good arguments are pronounced. But I, as an organizer of this, when you do it, when you put your heart and soul into it, you feel depressed because your brain cannot understand how these two parallel realities exist, how they coexist, because they somehow need just to interact. And that is why we tried somehow to, in our work, just we're coming to the conclusion now, the different approach that when we start thinking that, so then the challenge is not only in the relationship between the EU and Russia, which for some reason came to the situation what we have right now. It's a wider issue. It's an international relations issue. Politologists refer to it as critical disjunction. Critical disjunction. It means that all this system of relationship that we had, whether we liked it or didn't like it, so it started to move. And we don't understand where it's leading us, and that is why. So this lines of demarcation, not only between Russia and Europe, but it's between the EU, Brexit. So it's a good example of that. And NATO problems. And then we don't know what's happening on the sidelines of Eurasian Economic Community. It's part of this big process. I can tell you, I will just go back to my subject, which is closer to me, which is security. So the issue today is delineated like this anecdotal story. So when the Russian reset, so then when there was a mistake made in the word, and so then it's not about visions, good visions, bad visions of the general economic space from Moscow to Vladivostok. So it can become a means of a reset, but how to avoid the super reset, so the booster reset that will just throw us back into some horrible parallel reality. And that's and that is why we have good positive things in the area of trade. Excellent. We'll go back to what Gaidar spoke, Mr. Ambassador, when Wolfgang spoke about that. So then trust we need to build. This is right, and security is very important. This is all true, but against all these problems, there is one little window of opportunity that's opening up for us. Because by definition, so then Homo sapiens is a rational creature, because it's like the Caribbean crisis, because so full understanding of the impending horrible problem, at least we being rational human beings, so we certainly need to find a way. And that is why so the measures to increase to improve security becomes key for all of us. So what we're doing in Minsk right now, and so how so we fully realize that the Eastern Europe becomes the points of debate, the points of pitting by Russia and the Union relationship with Russia. And trying and demonstrating to the European Union, to NATO, that we could, being by Russia, so through additional transparent methods, in case of any incidents, we can reduce the probability of sliding them into the uncontrolled confrontation. So we are just offering ourselves to be a go-between. So can we use the potential of Belarus as a country unionized certainly with Russia, so part of the Russian military union, but at the same time be somehow a go-between and settle and come to good relations. Maybe it could become a first step that would be a real argument, a real material thing, so why it's practically required. That's why, for example, if we have this military component, a security component, Schneider Group, I admire their work, and so then the free economic zone from Lisbon to Vladivostok, but it cannot go out, seems to be unable to go outside the confrontational political security issues, and it stays within.
I wanted to call on a fellow European, if I may, Igor. Tony Brenton, sitting at the back, fellow Brit, was for many years the British ambassador here in Moscow. Tony, I wanted to begin with a proposition, which I believe Alice in Wonderland is quite popular in Russia. And those who are familiar with Alice in Wonderland may remember that Tweedledum and Tweedledee decided to have a battle. But they never did, because they discovered they were just like each other, and they had no real disagreement. So my question, Tony, is looking at Russia and Europe over the years, are they Tweedledum and Tweedledee?
Well, thank you, Giles, for pulling me into this, slightly unexpectedly. I have to say that as an Englishman, as people ask themselves, is Russia a European country? My answer is, well, is England a European country? Because, of course, we are, but we feel different. And I think exactly the same prevails in Russia. And therefore, I feel a certain sympathy with the difficulties that Russia has run into in its recent encounters with Europe. I don't think the question, I mean, I'm a boring, practical diplomat, finally. I don't think the sort of metaphysical question, is Russia European or not, actually matters very much. I personally believe that most Russians think of themselves as European, but as I say, different. What I think does matter is the way things are going. And as we've already heard from Wolfgang Ischinger, they are bad, and all the tendencies at the moment is that they're going to get worse, actually. And this comes from both sides, I have to say. I watched the misbehavior of various Russian agencies in their external activity, which simply compounds the anger and resentment and refusal of Europeans to do business with them. There's immense anger in London at the moment, of course, about the Skripal affair. On the other hand, the Deputy Minister Grushko referred to the Ukrainian issue. I look at an issue where you have an agreement, the Minsk agreement, you have the major European powers involved in it, and there are breaches, I think, from both sides, and you hear Europe regularly lambasting Russia for their breaches of the Minsk agreement and remaining strikingly silent over Ukrainian breaches of the agreement. So our view of ourselves as a fair, neutral arbiter undermines itself from the beginning. And on the question of, where is Russia going, where things are drifting, it's very clear. We are moving into a world where the central geopolitical confrontation is going to be between China and the West. And at the moment, the relationship between Russia and Europe is pushing Russia onto the wrong side of that confrontation from the European point of view. So I very much share Wolfgang's view and others' view that we need to begin to find ways of mending fences, that we, the European, the Western side, actually, as the vastly economically more powerful and also militarily more powerful side, need to be more willing to take risks than perhaps we expect Russia to take. And if I may, I would just point to three potential areas where things could be done. Ukraine, I've already mentioned. I think the European approach to the Ukrainian issue is scandalously one-sided. And there's a very dangerous precedent lying before us, which is what happened with Georgia in 2008, where, with Western encouragement, the Georgians launched an absurd and losing war against Russia and left a period of very bad relations thereafter. We, the Europeans, need to be ultra careful not to do the same with the Ukrainians. My second point that has been already raised, we should be finding ways, even at the time of differences between the two states, of rebuilding links between the civil societies, of finding scope for travel, for mutual understanding, for education projects, all of that. And I would like to see the European Union put a lot of money into that sort of rebuilding without any expectation of reciprocal action from the Russian authorities, or that would be nice to see. Two, there are obvious things that we can do with regard to sanctions. I think sanctions are politically untouchable at the moment, unfortunately, but there are little things that can be done around the edges. For example, we, the Europeans, have prevented the EBRD lending money to small Russian developing firms. That's insane. We want the Russian economy to develop in a way which is helpful to all of us. We should be encouraging these sort of economic difficulties. So, Marcus, if I may say to you, that's the sort of thing that Europe should be looking to do to begin to reconstruct the civil society relationship. And then finally, there have been various suggestions at the grand political level, and all of which seem to me to be good. But it seems to me there are areas where there is a clear mutual interest where Europe and Russia should be working together. Terrorism is an absolutely obvious one, and the The very dangerous and proliferating area of cybersecurity is another. Now, these are not going to be easy things for us to find early steps for cooperation on, but we should be talking about them. We should be creating dialogues on them. Giles, I don't think I answered your question about Alice in Wonderland, but I hope I gave you some sort of answer to your question. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Since I have been addressed directly, let me just remind ourselves that already today, Russian students are the biggest group of Erasmus Plus stipends recipients globally. And that includes China, which has 10 times the population. And Russian universities are the biggest group of universities globally partnering with EU member states universities under the Jean Monnet program. So I think we got the priorities which have been raised by you, Giles, and by the ambassador right. And Erasmus Plus, by the way, is the budget which will be increased the most under the next European multi-annual financial framework, namely it will be doubled. So I think here we are on the right track, but I agree that this will not suffice. By the way, Russian citizens are also the biggest group of Schengen visa recipients, 4 million every year, more than any other country, including China, with 10 times the population. So I think on civil society exchanges, we're trying to do our best. It's never enough, but I think the priorities are right.
Thank you, Marcus. And may I say from the chair, first step is to scrap the visas. Now, we're going to defy the organisers and ask for a little more time. And first of all, ask one of our hosts, Valentina Komleva, to say a few words, and then switch to Alexei Potansky. No, after...
Добрый день. Спасибо.
So good afternoon. Thank you for coming, and so we really appreciate it and visiting this section and working together. So then I'll take just 5 minutes. I'd like to talk about some mechanisms of bringing back trust and that's exactly what we started with. And so we just spoke many times, repeated this word, but we want to just understand the mechanisms. So just putting together the experience, recapping, understanding. So then how reconstitute trust. So how it's happening. So what we can do. So we need to develop international norms. So we need just to develop new legislation, the basis of which we try just to move forward and improve our relations. Unfortunately, the practice goes to show that this legislation moves to the areas of binding measures. But if the measures are binding, it means that if you violate them, there are sanctions can be applied. But the sanctions are not efficient. So thus, we can conclude that the international law, is it capable at the end of the day, becomes the instrument of institutionalization of trust? Can it become the the doer of resumption of trust? And so besides, so along our borders, so there are new actors that never existed before, so globally, so they never influenced international relations. That's transboundary actors, not only corporations, transnationals, then transnational religious organizations, transnational terrorist organizations, transboundary. And so within this internet, they impact a lot, and so they do not fall under the norms of international jurisdiction to the extent of the formation and participation in international cooperation. They don't. They're not within. They're not in the cards. And so then the second point is the tradition that we unfortunately we live on the basis of long tradition. So while Russia had been helping for many years the Latin American countries on this capital of trust, we still live on it. We still take from it. And because we helped for a long period of time. So, for example, that the EU and the Eurasian Economic Community failed to come together, and they cannot develop these practical approaches of mutually trustful relations. And as a person who I develop and I generalized as my responsibility, then I was very interested to listen to my international colleagues, which actually just all looked like that Russia has to do it, because it's just just playing into one gate. So then all the scoring points only in one gate. So that we have to follow their advice. And so I think that has been repeatedly said that Russia has to do this and this and this and this. And it's only unilateral, and it's not properly. So then there's this binding measures that are offered.
So, the creation of new models and practices of trust with the new international actors and new integration community probably, well, cannot be expected. And now, thirdly, the practices you mentioned today a lot about those islands of cultural educational exchange are good for the future generations. It's the future political elite. But as a person who was heavily involved in Erasmus, we have students from 20 countries in my department. So students from the European Union are not very actively coming to Russia. Well, only the curious come because because the information landscape in Europe is such that the European student goes to Russia just like it his last days of his life. They come here out of morbid curiosity, and if they do, parents consider him as going, as a hero going to perish, Unless we change the information policy, including the European Union, we shall hardly create this common culture of trust. And there is one more tool of negative nature. The events where I attend, unfortunately, well, it's lobbyism and corruption in making international political decisions. There are schemes that in fact will prevent making the political favorable decision in spite of your, liking of Russia. There are dependent countries, dependent on stronger players. There are mechanisms of strong players who allow them to promote their own interests, and there are shadow structures that carry out corruption schemes. We would like in future, now we have many institutions here and agencies that analyze international practices, just to study them, look at them. How can you, generalize and improve international trust? Thank you. Well, as we say, the last but not the least, Professor Bordansky from High School of Economics, at least out of solidarity, I'll give you 7 minutes. Yeah, it's very generous. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, for the opportunity to talk. I'm from High School of Economics and Institute of International Relations and International Policy, IMMO. I think the most important concern how to prevent increasing the gap, the distance between the EU and Russia. So briefly, I'll try to speak on 4 points. How we can prevent our relations to become worse. And I shall take the liberty, though I'm an economist, but I shall take the liberty to consider some history, some historic events, because lately some people actually offer concepts that target to take us away from Europe, and they are quite serious and acute problems of Russia and the EU, mutual problems. Then next, how can we protect the citizens and businesses from sanctions and again prevent ignoring Russia, which has been offered by European Well, actually, the first step to Europe was made by Peter the Great. But for him, we're not talking about his methods of westernization and Europeization in Russia. The methods were horrible, but still, we wouldn't have Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Tchaikovsky, and so on. 2 years ago, I was flying to Poland to a conference, and next to me there was a Polish guy, and he was reading a book and just looking into the window, and I saw the name of the book. Well, every Russian should understand some Polish, like Zbrodnia and Kara. It's crime and punishment, I guess. Yeah, crime and punishment. Then I asked him, yes, he said it's Dostoevsky, the Polish guy said, my neighbor on the plane. And I just want to remind you, those writers of the 19th century have caused great influence to the intellectual elite of Europe until today. And after, but still, it all started before Peter the Great. After the Mongol invasion, the Russian counties were fighting each other. Now we have a very popular image of a Tsar who was collecting the Russian lands together. Who was that? Many of you here probably visited the great Novgorod and probably saw that among the many statues on the monument to the 1000th year of Russia, there are 4 Lithuanian counts, Gedimin, Olger, Geistut, and another one. And it turns out that the Gedimin, the Lithuanian count, was a very efficient collector or gatherer of Russian lands who brought them together. Under his reign, there were so many Russian counties, let alone the Moskva county. And Gedimin actually signed off as Gedimin, the Tsar of the Lithuanians and Russians. And so then Olgerd and Keistut and Vytovt followed up, and just making this Lithuanian-Russian principality. And we, as we like to say, that chance in history plays a great role. And there was a chance, Vytovt died untimely, and Moscow before 1425 could become a part of the great Lithuanian county. And probably today we wouldn't even argue about, belonging to Europe. We would be part of Lithuania. But starting Yeltsin's time, we love to develop links to the great families of the Russian nobility. So all those, many of those noble blood people are descendants from the Gedimin count. Yeah. And actually over 50 cities were subject to Magdeburg law at that time. So a couple of words about our Tsars: Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Catherine II, Alexander the First. Ivan the Terrible was a symbol for our nationalistic people. Ivan the Terrible, for our nationalists. He actually dreamed to become an English king, by the way. That was his dream. And he did something, to achieve his dream. When he died, the local servant, actually said that our English Tsar has passed away. Peter the Great, in the beginning, dreamed to become an English admiral. Catherine II, she was a German by blood, and she had great connections with the European intellectuals. Alexander I, he spoke French better than Napoleon, and at their first meeting, everyone paid attention to the fact that Alexander the Great, the Russian Tsar, spoke French better than Napoleon. And then in the 20th century, but for the German and American companies, probably there would be no industrialization of the Russian state. And Alexander was very right in saying that since the year 2000 we started kind of a rise. I would say earlier than that. I was lucky in June 1994 in Corfu to visit Corfu when the partnership agreement was signed between EU and Russia. 1994. It was an unimaginable moment, a festive day, euphoria of relations between the European Union and Russia. And for Yeltsin, they have done everything to please him. The Brits sent the best yacht, and the signing took place in a Christian church they found for this ceremony. And at this historical background, now we hear ideas to turn east. Thank God, today this idea, at least over the last 2 years, Mr. Putin rephrased it. Now he's talking about the big Eurasia, but this, turn to the east, turning east has taken us away and sown futile illusions. I remember the mission of Shuvalov, I believe autumn of 2015, when a group of businessmen and officials went to Asia, to Southeast Asia, to see how we could find loans at the same terms, and it turns out that impossible to find loans at the same terms. But in 2018, we faced a very strange problem when Chinese banks started restricting transactions with Russian companies because they comply religiously to the American sanctions. They said we shall be and they did nothing to respond to our complaints. It's not a turn to this; it's the eastern vector in the economic policy of Russia. Along with the Western vector, which is very important, and the European Union and the EU is the most important partner for us in the trade exchange. Still, EU is in the top chart, though the numbers are dropping. And in spite of this deep, long joint history, there are still attempts to prove that our efforts to join Europe were futile. I mean, in May, in the Russian Global Policy magazine, there was an article published of Vladislav Surkov, solitude of the half-blooded person. Our foreign guests can read this article in English. It's a magazine in both languages. Solitude, or rather loneliness, of a half-blood. And it's like a manifesto of those who have the habit of using the budget or the oil, and there is no it's a pity that a person with a certain philological talent wrote such an article, just to see how many people will kind of take the bait that geopolitically we are doomed to be alone for the next 300 years. And now speaking about economics and the meeting of Russia and European Union. So our problem number one is lack of structural reforms. Western sanctions is the problem number two. But the structural reform is the top priority. Once the sanctions would be cancelled today, once the sanctions are cancelled, some companies would feel better, but it would not remove the main issue of the main problem of our economy. EU, it's difficult to list all the problems inside the EU, Brexit, migration, and leadership that related to Merkel, and Macron has got a new live for discussion and relevance. Let me quote a phrase from
the most recent edition, Figaro. So that if Macron does not regain control over his ship, then there's danger that the elections will turn into anti-Macron referendum. So the driving forces that Macron identified as enemies, Hungarian Orban, Salvini, Italian, in May 19, so they will become a good example they set to follow. And because for Russia, what's important is Russia wants a strong Europe. When something is wrong in Europe, immediately its opponents that naturally are against cooperation with Russia. So they say, you see what's happening in Europe? No, we don't need it. We don't need Europe. We should be, because some Russians are against it. So certainly we want strong Europe. So the Europeans have a good relation. There's a special subject for relationship with the United States. One minute. You remember what Trump said, famous wording that there are three enemies: EU, NATO, and WTO. So I just give up for comments. Because the sanctions of the EU and the US sanctions are two different sets of sanctions. The US sanctions we will never be able just to lift, impossible. But remember the Jackson-Vanik so lasted for 40 years. So with the European sanctions, the situation is quite different. So that's why we say. So there's one quote from Spiegel. In the United States, there is an idea that Russia can be put on its knees. And Europeans in their majority see differently. They don't want to have a bankrupt state with lots of nuclear arms on its knees. So that's the main difference in position of the Europeans and the Americans, because we don't think that it's logical to make Russia kneel short-term and long-term. That's the main difference between the approaches exercised by the United States and Europe. What needs to be done? What's to do? I think just remembering the experience of European integration. So it would be great, it would be wonderful to have a huge, big, one large project, joint project, because you remember that the European integration started with the European integration of coal and steel, two mortal enemies, so joint forces, and that's how it all started in the 50s. Big project. Let me give you, so then Soyuz Apollo projects, a space project with the United States. So these joint projects, so it gave a lot, generated a lot for the future cooperation. And today, so the cooperation in space stays probably one of the few things that still maintain, keep our ties, tenuous ties with the United States and Russia. And that is why, so then availability of a big, large, long-term short project would be great to have. And then, so I'm just finishing up by what Ellen Karen Dankus said. Russia was snatched away from Europe by the Tatar-Mongol Yoe for several centuries. Then another century by the Marxist and communist ideology. And every time Russia found its way back to Europe, now it's time for Russia to take roots in Europe forever. And so we are exceeding our time, and so we have no time for questions and answers. That is why I have a difficult task, and it's very honorable task. Giles asked me just to finish up our roundtable. Allow me just to make a few statements. First, so Europe, one way or the other, so it stretches from Lisbon to Vladivostok. It's there. It's obvious. So the writing is on the wall. Sometimes we quarrel, sometimes we make peace, sometimes even war. But we are Europe, and so like it's a Judeo-Christian culture, so language culture, and so we are inextricably mingled together. So then the cycles that we go through are described by the academician Yanova, very interesting to read. So the cycles are there, mathematically calculated, so you can calculate when we will become friends again. Mathematically it can be calculated. So that's the first statement. Second, so in the area of security, we have no trust, yes, in order to start talking. and I don't think just it will appear right after the elections in Ukraine. But we need to work on it, and one of the best diplomats and just most brightest minds are working in Minsk and Moscow just to achieve that purpose. And in Washington, I hope, so they're working on it as well, just to make it good. And so the third position. So those who are involved in business, they all say, just forget about those politicians, so let's resume our good relations. Let's resume doing what we've been doing for so many years. And so there are good reasons for that, good foundations, all the dialogues that bring about some good contracts, and so then the EU integration process, so it's not there for political reasons, but it will come. So then, and the fourth thing, so the older generation were talking about this, the conflicts. So what Bekhterev was saying, so he said that if you separate between the EU and Russia, so it will be worse both for Russia and for the EU. Yes, and your security will be at a lower level if you separate unequivocally. And so that is why just I'm trying to finish on a cheerful note, but at the same time remembering that the older generation are trying to separate Russia and Europe. So thus our roundtable discussion was very saturated, very interesting. So we have listened to very extremely interesting, reliable, wonderful insights, and so it was very important, broadening, and interesting. And so I would like just to ask, to thank the RANEPA and with Mao, we'll try just to certainly later recap in a certain document and put it in a document that will definitely distribute it among the students and internationally. So when we just will do this document eventually. So then all those who would like to. So please, your comments and your presentations, your thesis, your minutes, please send them to me or to my secretary. So thank you very much. It's been a great roundtable discussion. Thank you.